Britain say no to the taxation without representation. Today we tell about relations between the American colonies and Britain after the French and Indian War about 250 years ago. The French and the Indian War was one part of a war conflict between Britain and France. It was fought to decide which of the two powerful nations would rule the North America. The British defeated the French in North America in 1763. As a result, it took control of lands that had been claimed by France. Britain now was responsible for almost 2 million people in the 19 American colonies and 60,000 French-speaking people in Canada. In addition to political and economic responsibility, Britain had to protect all these colonies from different groups of Indians. This would be cost a lot of money. Britain already has spent a lot of money sending troops and material to the colonies to fight the French and Indian War. It's believed that American colonies should now help pay for that war. The colonies in America in 1763 were very different from those who had settled there more than 100 years before. They had different ideas. They had come to consider their colonial legislatures as smaller but similar to the parliament in Britain. These little parliaments had held them rule themselves for more than 100 years. The colonies began to feel that their legislature should also have the powers that the British Parliament had. The situation had changed in England too. In 1707, the nation became officially known as Great Britain. Its king no longer controlled parliament as he had in the early 1600s. Then the king decided all major questions, especially those concerning the colonies. But power had moved from the king to the parliament. It was the legislature that decided major questions by the time of French and Indian War, especially the power to tax. The parliaments in the colonies began to believe that they should have this power of taxation too. The first English settlers in America considered themselves citizens of England. They had crossed a dangerous ocean to create a little England in new place, to trade with the mother country, and to spread their religion. By 1763, however, the colonies thought of themselves as Americans. Many of their families had been in North America for 50 to 100 years. They had cleared the land, built homes, fought Indians, and made life for themselves far away from Britain. They had different everybody concerns than the people in Britain. Their way of life was different too. They did not want anyone else to tell them how to govern themselves. The British, however, they believed that the purpose of a colony was to serve the mother country. The government treated colonies differently from citizens at home. It demanded special taxes from them. It also ordered them to feed British troops and let them live in their house. Britain claimed that the soldiers were in the colonies to protect the people. The people asked, "From whom?" As long as the French were nearby in Canada, the colonists needed the protection of British Army and Navy. After the French were gone, following their defeat in the French and Indian War, the colonists felt they no longer needed British military protection. The British government demanded that the colonies pay higher and higher taxes. One reason was the British government wanted to show the colonies that it was in control. Another reason was that Britain was having money problems. Foreign wars have left it with big debts. The British thought the colonies should help pay some of this debt, especially those resulting from the French and Indian War. The American colonies might have agreed, but they wanted to have a say in the decision. They wanted the right to vote about their own taxes, like the people living in Britain, but no colonists were permitted to serve in the British Parliament, so they protested that they were being taxed without being represented. In 1764, the British Parliament approved the Sugar Acts. This legislation placed taxes on sugar, coffee, wines, and other products imported to America in large amounts. It increased by 2 times the taxes on European products sent to the colonies through Britain. The British government also approved new measures at enforcing all trade laws, and it decided to restrict the printing of paper money in the colonies. The American colonists opposed all these new laws, yet they could not agree about how to resist. Colonial assemblies approved protests against the law, but the protest actions were all different and had no real effects. Business groups tried to organize boycotts of goods, but these were not very successful until the British government approved another tax in the 1769, a tax on stamps. The Stamp Act probably angered more American colonies than any earlier tax. It said the colony had to buy a British stamp for every piece of printed paper they used. That means they would be taxed for every piece of a newspaper, every document, even very plain card. The colonists refused to pay. Colonial assemblies approved resolutions suggesting that the British Parliament had no right to tax the colonies at all. Some colonists were so angry that they attacked British stamp agents. History experts say the main reason the colonists were angry was because Britain had rejected the idea of no taxation without representation. Almost no colonists wanted to be independent of Britain at that time, yet all of them valued their local self-rules and their right as British citizens. They considered the Stamp Act to be the worst in a series of violations of these rights. The American colonists refused to obey the Stamp Act. They also refused to buy British goods. Almost 1,000 store owners signed non-importation agreements. This cost British businessmen so much money that they demanded that the government end the Stamp Act. Parliament finally cancelled the law in 1766. The colonies immediately ended their ban against British goods. The same day that Parliament cancelled the Stamp Act, however, it approved the Declaratory Acts. This was a statement saying the colonies existed to serve breeding, and that breeding could prove any law if wanted. Most American colonists considered this statement to be illegal. History experts say this shows how separated the colonies had become from breeding. Colonial assemblies were able to prove their own law, but only with the permission of the British Parliament. The colonies, however, considered the work of their assembly as their own form of self-rule, breeding ended the stamp but did not stop demanding taxes. In 1767, Parliament approved a series of new taxes called the Taxation Acts. These were named after the government official who proposed them. The Taxation Acts placed taxes on glass, tea, lead, paint, and paper imported into the colonies. The American colonists rejected the Taxation Acts and started a new boycott of breeding goods. They also make efforts to increase manufacturing in the colonies. By the end of 1769, they had reduced by half the amount of goods imported from breeding. The colonists also began to communicate with each other about their problems. In 1768, the Massachusetts General Council sent a letter to the legislature of the other colonies. It said the Taxation Act violated the colonies' nature and constitutional rights. When news of the letter reached London, British officials ordered the colonial government of Massachusetts to dismiss the legislature. Then they moved 4,000 British troops into Boston, the biggest city in the Massachusetts and the biggest city in the American colonies. The people of Boston hated the British soldiers. The soldiers were controlling their streets and living in their houses. This tension led to violence. That will be our story next week.